Nicholas sat at the edge of his desk, his hands clenched into tight fists, staring at the family portrait on the wall. The vibrant image of his wife, Maria, and their daughter Sophie haunted him now more than ever. Maria's sudden death had left a void in the house, a space so thick with grief that it felt like the walls were closing in on him. But what was worse, Sophie had withdrawn entirely. She barely spoke, her once sparkling eyes now empty pools of sorrow. He had been consumed by work, always focused on expanding his corporate empire, flying across continents, sitting in boardrooms, sealing deals, while Maria had been the one holding everything together at home. Now, with her gone, he was at a loss. He didn't know how to reach Sophie, how to be a father in her time of need. Sophie, Nicholas muttered to himself. He knew she was upstairs, locked in her room as she had been since the funeral. He hadn't heard her voice in days. The nanny had been feeding her, but their exchanges were limited to simple gestures. Sophie had retreated into a world of silence, and Nicholas was left to wrestle with his guilt and failure. The phone rang, snapping him out of his thoughts. He grabbed it and saw the name on the screen. It was his assistant, Julia. "Sir," Julia's voice crackled through the speaker. "I've found someone who might be able to help." Nicholas exhaled deeply, running a hand through his graying hair. "Go on." "Her name is Amelia. She's a psychologist, young, unconventional, but she comes highly recommended. She's worked with children, especially those who have experienced trauma." Nicholas leaned back in his chair. He had tried other therapists before, but none had broken through Sophie's shell. He had to do something, anything. "Set up a meeting," he said, his voice tight with the weight of the decision. The silence lingered after the call ended, echoing his hesitation. Could a stranger really help his daughter when he, her father, could not? That night, he stood outside Sophie's door, his hand hovering above the doorknob. He had knocked countless times before, only to be met with more silence. Tonight, though, he hesitated for longer, hoping for a miracle. But again, nothing. Turning away, Nicholas walked back downstairs, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the oppressive stillness. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his chest. He wasn't just losing Sophie to her grief. He was already lost to his own. The next morning arrived with an unfamiliar tension hanging in the air. Nicholas stood by the large window in his study, watching the driveway for signs of Amelia's arrival. He barely knew anything about this young psychologist, and the idea of entrusting her with Sophie made his stomach churn. Desperation had forced his hand. A small, modest car finally pulled up to the house, a stark contrast to the luxury vehicles Nicholas was used to seeing. He watched as a slender woman stepped out. She was younger than he'd expected, mid-20s perhaps, with short dark hair and an air of confidence that didn't match her simple appearance. Amelia strode toward the front door, her movements calm, unhurried. Nicholas was waiting for her when she entered. His sharp eyes scanned her from head to toe, assessing. Amelia met his gaze without flinching, her expression composed, as though she was already aware of what he was looking for. "Mr. Bradford," she greeted him, extending her hand. Her voice was soft but steady, with an almost unsettling calm. "Nicholas, please," he replied, shaking her hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." Amelia gave a small nod. "I understand the situation is urgent." Nicholas gestured for her to sit in the living room, where the grand fireplace sat cold and unused. He wasn't sure how to begin, how to explain what Sophie had become, a hollow version of herself. He sat across from her, his fingers tapping nervously against his leg. "I've tried everything," Nicholas began, his voice strained. "Therapists, counselors. Nothing has worked. Sophie, she's not talking. She doesn't respond to anyone. She barely eats. It's been months since my wife." He paused, the words catching in his throat. Amelia listened intently, her expression neutral but focused. "Children process grief differently," she said, "sometimes in ways that aren't easy to understand. It can take time to get through to them." Nicholas felt frustration bubbling up inside him. He'd heard all of this before, from every expert who had stepped through their door. They all promised patience, but none could promise results. "I don't have time," he muttered, more to himself than to her. Amelia seemed to notice his impatience, but she didn't react to it. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with intent. I understand you've been struggling to connect with Sophie. I don't follow the traditional methods. What I do is different. I approach therapy from the child's world, not ours. Nicholas frowned, not entirely sure what she meant. Different how? Amelia leaned back, her tone even. I engage with children through their emotions, their hidden thoughts. It's less about talking and more about reaching them through other means. There may be things that will seem unusual to you, but I need you to trust the process. Nicholas didn't like the sound of that. Unusual? Other means? He had been in control of every aspect of his life for years, and the thought of surrendering that control, even for Sophie, was unnerving. But what choice did he have? He nodded slowly. If you think it'll help, it will, Amelia said confidently, without hesitation. But there's something I need to ask of you. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. I need to be alone with her. No interruptions. No watching from the sidelines. Nicholas stiffened. Alone? Amelia gave a firm nod. Sophie is grieving in silence, but silence speaks too. I need to be in her space, observe her without any interference. Only then can I understand what she's not saying. The idea unsettled Nicholas. Letting a stranger, this young woman with her mysterious methods, be alone with his daughter. It felt wrong. But as he sat there, staring into Amelia's unwavering gaze, something in him broke. He realized how powerless he had become in his own home. He couldn't reach Sophie, and this might be the only way. Fine, Nicholas agreed, his voice tight. But I want updates. Constant updates. Amelia rose from her seat. I'll let you know when there's something to tell. Her words hung in the air, leaving Nicholas unsure if he'd made the right decision. She didn't waste any time. As soon as their conversation ended, Amelia asked to be shown to Sophie's room. Nicholas led her upstairs, his mind racing with doubts. The hallway was dimly lit, the silence heavy. They stopped in front of Sophie's door, the same door Nicholas had stood in front of countless times, hoping for a response that never came. Amelia stood still for a moment, staring at the door, as if she was absorbing the atmosphere around her. Then, without knocking, she opened it and stepped inside. Nicholas peered in after her, catching a glimpse of his daughter sitting by the window, her back to the door, staring blankly outside. Amelia closed the door behind her, leaving Nicholas in the hallway, staring at the solid wood barrier between him and his daughter. For the first time in months, something was happening, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for what would come next. Nicholas paced the length of the hallway outside Sophie's room, his nerves on edge. He hadn't heard a sound from inside, not a whisper, not even the faintest shuffle. The silence was suffocating. His thoughts raced, wondering what Amelia could possibly be doing in there. He didn't like the idea of being kept in the dark, not when it came to Sophie. But he had agreed to this, reluctantly giving Amelia the space she insisted on. As his mind wandered, a sudden creak snapped him back to the present. The door to Sophie's room opened, and Amelia emerged, her face unreadable. Nicholas stepped forward, desperate for answers. How did it go? He asked, trying to keep his voice calm despite the anxiety gnawing at him. Amelia met his eyes briefly before glancing down the hallway, as if checking for something or someone. We made some progress, she said evenly, her voice calm but with an edge of mystery. Progress? Nicholas pressed, his brow furrowing. What does that mean? Did she talk? Did she? Amelia held up a hand, cutting him off. Not exactly. Sophie's not ready to speak. Not yet. But I learned a lot just by being in her space, by observing her reactions. Nicholas's frustration bubbled to the surface. He had been hoping for more, some breakthrough that would indicate Sophie was on the path to recovery. Instead, it sounded like nothing had changed. Look, Amelia said, sensing his frustration. This process isn't about forcing Sophie to talk. She's not going to open up just because we want her to. But there are other ways she communicates, ways she doesn't even realize. Nicholas stared at her, skepticism evident on his face. Like what? He asked, his voice tight. Amelia stepped closer, her tone softening but still deliberate. It's in the small things. The way she arranges her space, the objects she keeps close, her body language. It tells me what's going on beneath the surface. Sophie is deeply protective of her mother's memory. Her room is almost like a shrine, filled with little reminders of Maria. Photographs, old letters, even a perfume bottle that still has Maria's scent. Nicholas's heart sank at the mention of Maria. He hadn't been in Sophie's room since the funeral. He couldn't bear it. The idea that Sophie had surrounded herself with fragments of her mother's life. It was painful to hear. But then Amelia's expression shifted, growing more serious. "There's something else," she continued, her voice dropping. "Sophie has created a world for herself, a place where she can still feel safe. I found drawings, dozens of them, hidden under her bed. They're intricate, detailed, and they all tell the same story. A world where her mother is still alive, but she's trapped." Nicholas's breath caught in his throat. "Trapped? What do you mean?" Amelia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. It's as if Sophie believes that Maria is still with her in some way, but not fully. In the drawings, there are always shadows around her mother, like she's being pulled away. Sophie seems to be stuck in that moment of loss, unable to move forward because she doesn't want to lose the last connection she has to her. Nicholas swallowed hard, his mind racing to process what Amelia was saying. His chest tightened, imagining Sophie, alone in her room, drawing over and over again, trying to hold on to the image of her mother. Amelia stepped back, giving him space to absorb the weight of her words. This is why forcing her to talk won't work. She's protecting that world she's created, and if we push too hard, she might retreat further into it. Nicholas's jaw clenched. "So what do we do?" Amelia folded her arms, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "We have to let her show us this world in her own time. She needs to trust that it's safe to let go, even if just a little bit. I'm going to continue working with her, using art, play, things that make her feel in control. It's not about making her face the truth all at once, but helping her come to terms with it, piece by piece." Nicholas felt a pit of dread in his stomach. It sounded like such a slow process, and he wasn't sure he could stand waiting, feeling powerless while his daughter remained locked in her own world. "I'll need more time with her," Amelia said, her voice steady. "But I need you to trust me, Nicholas. This will work. Sophie is reaching out in ways she doesn't even realize." Nicholas rubbed a hand over his face, the weight of his exhaustion settling over him like a heavy cloak. He wanted to believe Amelia. He wanted to trust her, but this path seemed so unclear, so uncertain. As he stood there, struggling to respond, the door to Sophie's room creaked open. Sophie stepped out into the hallway, her small frame almost swallowed by the oversized sweater she wore. Her eyes, once vibrant with life, were dull and distant. She glanced at her father for just a moment, her gaze fleeting before she turned to Amelia. Without a word, she walked over to Amelia and handed her a piece of paper, folded carefully. Amelia took it, her expression gentle as she unfolded the paper. Nicholas watched in stunned silence as Amelia glanced at the drawing. Her face remained composed, but her eyes flickered with something Nicholas couldn't read. Amelia carefully folded the paper back up and looked at Sophie with a soft smile. "Thank you, Sophie." Sophie didn't respond. She just stood there, as if waiting for something, some sign that her message had been received. Then, without another word, she turned and retreated back into her room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. Nicholas stared at Amelia, his mind racing. "What did she give you?" Amelia held the folded paper in her hand, her eyes still on the door. "It's another drawing," she said quietly, "but this one's different." Nicholas's heart pounded. "Different how?" Amelia hesitated for a moment, then handed him the paper. Nicholas took it and slowly unfolded it. His breath caught in his throat as he saw the image, a crude sketch of a house with 3 figures standing outside. One was clearly Sophie, and next to her was a woman, Maria. But the third figure, it was him. Nicholas felt his throat tighten. The figure that represented him was standing apart from the other two, his face blurred, indistinct. The distance between them felt palpable, almost as though he were a ghost haunting the edges of their lives. Amelia's voice broke the silence. She's trying to tell you something, Nicholas. She wants you in her world, but she's not sure you belong there." Nicholas's hands shook as he stared at the drawing. For the first time in months, he felt a crack in the numbness that had settled over him. But what if Sophie was right? What if he didn't belong in her world anymore? Nicholas had been away on a business trip for nearly a week. It wasn't something he wanted to do, not with everything going on with Sophie, but the demands of his company were relentless. He had left reluctantly, trusting Amelia to continue her work with Sophie in his absence. His mind had never fully left home, though. Every email he received from Amelia provided updates, but they were always brief, never the detailed explanations he craved. When he returned, stepping through the front door of his once quiet and grieving home, he was not prepared for what he found. The house was alive with sound. From the kitchen, he could hear soft music playing, a song Maria used to love. His heart clenched at the familiar melody. He dropped his suitcase at the door and slowly made his way toward the sound, a strange mixture of hope and apprehension bubbling in his chest. As he turned the corner into the kitchen, he stopped dead in his tracks. There was Sophie, sitting at the kitchen table. She was smiling. Not the hollow, forced smile she had occasionally managed when people were watching, but a real, genuine smile. She was talking with Amelia, her voice soft but clear, discussing something about school. Nicholas stood there, frozen, watching his daughter. Sophie looked different. She sat up straight, her posture confident in a way that startled him. The shy, withdrawn girl he had left behind seemed to have vanished. Even her eyes, which had once been clouded by grief, sparkled with a light he hadn't seen in months. "Dad!" Sophie's voice rang out, cutting through the fog of his thoughts. She had spotted him standing at the doorway, her face lighting up with excitement. "You're back." Nicholas blinked, struggling to process the moment. Sophie was speaking to him, directly, with warmth. He tried to compose himself, but the shock of seeing her so transformed left him feeling like he had walked into a dream. For a second, he didn't know how to respond. "Yeah, I'm back," he finally said, his voice rougher than he intended. He walked over to her, his movements hesitant, as if afraid she might retreat back into the shell he had grown so used to. But Sophie didn't retreat. She stood up from her chair and walked over to him, wrapping her arms around him in a tight hug. Nicholas's heart stuttered in his chest. It had been months since she had shown any affection. He stood there, frozen, before slowly wrapping his arms around her in return, unsure if the moment was real. "I missed you," Sophie said softly, her words muffled against his chest. "I missed you too," Nicholas whispered, his throat tight. His hands gently patted her back, as though he were afraid to break whatever fragile thing had emerged between them. After a few moments, Sophie pulled back, giving him a bright smile before returning to her seat at the kitchen table. She continued talking with Amelia, her voice light, as if this new version of her had always existed. Nicholas glanced at Amelia, whose expression remained composed but watchful. She gave him a small nod, as if acknowledging the significance of the moment, but offered no further explanation. Later that evening, once Sophie had gone upstairs to prepare for bed, Nicholas cornered Amelia in the living room. His face was tight with concern, his mind swirling with questions that had been building since his arrival. "What the hell happened while I was gone?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. Amelia didn't flinch at the intensity of his tone. She calmly set down the book she had been reading and turned to face him. "Sophie's been making a lot of progress," she said, her voice steady. "I can see that," Nicholas shot back, his frustration evident. "But something's off. She's different. Too different. She's confident. She's talking. More than I've seen in months. But it feels strange. Almost like she's a different person." Amelia raised an eyebrow, but didn't respond immediately. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, weighing how much to say. "She's been processing things in her own way, Nicholas. The Sophie you're seeing now isn't a different person. She's the same girl, but she's starting to come out of that deep place of grief." Nicholas paced in front of the fireplace, his mind racing. "But it's too fast," he muttered, half to himself. "She wasn't like this before I left. It's only been a week." "Sophie is still grieving," Amelia said quietly, watching him closely. She's just learning to wear it differently. Nicholas stopped pacing and turned to face Amelia. His eyes narrowed. What aren't you telling me? Amelia's expression didn't change, but a flicker of something unreadable passed behind her eyes. There's nothing I'm keeping from you, Nicholas. Sophie is healing in her own time. But you have to understand, grief isn't linear. Sometimes it feels like nothing is changing for months, and then suddenly, everything shifts. This is one of those shifts. Nicholas clenched his jaw, still uneasy. There was something in the air, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, and it left him feeling unsettled. And those drawings? He asked. Did she show you more of them? Amelia nodded. Yes, she's been drawing every day, and I've been encouraging her to express what she's feeling through her art. It's been revealing. Nicholas frowned, the memory of that haunting drawing, the one where he stood apart from Sophie and Maria, surfacing in his mind. And what is she feeling? He asked, his voice low. Amelia met his gaze, her eyes sharp with understanding. She's still processing the loss of her mother, and she's coming to terms with where you fit into her world. It's going to take time, Nicholas. The drawings are part of that process. Nicholas stared at her, his chest tight with unease. Is she really okay? He asked, his voice almost a whisper, as if he were afraid of the answer. Amelia hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. She's doing better than she was before, but there's still a long road ahead. Nicholas didn't feel reassured. Something about Sophie's transformation felt too sudden, too abrupt. She was articulate and confident now, but there was a distance in her that hadn't been there before. It was as though she had built a wall between herself and the world, including him. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Nicholas found himself standing outside her room again, just as he had so many nights before. The door was slightly ajar, and he could see a sliver of light from her bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. He gently pushed the door open and stepped inside. Sophie was sitting on her bed, sketching something in her notebook. Her face was calm, serene, but as Nicholas moved closer, he saw the drawing she was working on, and his heart sank. It was another drawing of their family, but this time, the figure representing him was almost faded, as if it were disappearing entirely from the page. Nicholas's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the image, unsure of what it meant. Sophie looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and for a moment, the silence between them felt heavier than it had ever been. I'm glad you're home, Dad, Sophie said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But as Nicholas stood there, looking into his daughter's eyes, he couldn't shake the feeling that, despite her words, she was drifting further away from him. Days passed, and the uneasy feeling Nicholas had about Sophie only deepened. On the surface, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. Sophie continued her routine, attending school, interacting with Amelia, and even chatting with Nicholas during meals. But something about her was off. She had become someone he didn't fully recognize. It wasn't just the sudden confidence or her articulate speech. It was the distance in her eyes, the way she seemed to operate on a plane just beyond his reach. One evening, as Nicholas sat at the dinner table with Sophie, he watched her closely, searching for signs of the daughter he once knew. Sophie was telling him about a new project at school, her voice bright, her words sharp and clear. But there was no warmth in her tone, no spark of connection between them. It was like listening to a stranger recite a script. And so, the teacher said I could present first next week, Sophie said, finishing her story with a calm smile. That's great, Sophie, Nicholas responded, forcing a smile. I'm proud of you. Sophie smiled back, but her eyes were elsewhere, distant, as though she were looking through him rather than at him. Nicholas's stomach twisted. There was no tension, no hostility, but no real closeness either. He could feel the widening gap between them, even if he couldn't see it. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Nicholas found himself once again in the living room with Amelia. She had become a fixture in the house, so much so that her presence felt almost natural, yet Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling of unease that accompanied her constant proximity to Sophie. I need to talk to you, Nicholas said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, laced with the frustration that had been building inside him. Amelia glanced up from her notebook, her face calm, as always. "Of course," she replied, setting the notebook aside. "What's on your mind?" Nicholas sat forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Sophie, she's changed. It's not just that she's talking more or that she's more confident. It's like he paused, struggling to find the right words. It's like she's someone else." Amelia's expression remained neutral, but her eyes flickered with understanding. "Sophie is evolving," she said slowly. "She's learning how to exist without the weight of her grief controlling her. That might seem like a drastic change, but it's part of the process." Nicholas frowned. "But is she really okay? I mean, I'm glad she's coming out of her shell, but it feels unnatural. She's not herself. I don't even recognize her sometimes." Amelia tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "Healing from trauma doesn't mean returning to who you were before. Sophie will never be the same as she was when Maria was alive. But that doesn't mean she's lost. She's just finding a new version of herself." Nicholas leaned back, the weight of Amelia's words pressing down on him. "But what if this version of her, this new Sophie, what if I'm not a part of it?" Amelia's eyes softened, her voice gentle. "You are a part of it, Nicholas, but she's still figuring out where you fit. Right now, she's navigating a world where she has to redefine her relationships, with her mother's memory, with herself, and with you." Nicholas rubbed a hand over his face, frustration mixing with helplessness. "I just want my daughter back," he muttered. "You still have her," Amelia replied firmly. "She's just growing. You have to let her find her way." The conversation ended there, but Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't being said. There was always something just beneath the surface with Amelia, something he couldn't quite reach. He trusted her expertise, but part of him wondered if she was influencing Sophie in ways that weren't entirely clear. The following day, Nicholas received a call from Sophie's school. The teacher wanted to discuss Sophie's performance in class. Nervous, Nicholas arrived at the school that afternoon, unsure of what to expect. As he sat across from Sophie's teacher in her bright, cluttered classroom, he braced himself for whatever news was coming. "Sophie has been doing incredibly well, Mr. Bradford," the teacher began, smiling warmly. "Her grades have improved, and she's become much more engaged in class discussions. It's like she's found a new sense of confidence." Nicholas nodded slowly, his heart sinking even though the words were meant to be positive. "That's good to hear," he said, forcing a smile. But the teacher's expression shifted slightly, her tone growing more serious. "There is one thing, though. Something that's been a little concerning." Nicholas's pulse quickened. "What is it?" "Sophie has been talking about things that seem beyond her years," the teacher said carefully. "She's mentioned topics that are quite advanced for her age, ideas about life and death, philosophical concepts. It's impressive, of course, but it's unusual for someone so young to grasp these ideas so deeply." Nicholas's stomach dropped. "What kinds of things has she been saying?" he asked, his voice tense. The teacher hesitated, as if unsure how much to reveal. "She's been talking about how she sees the world as a reflection. Like nothing is real, just reflections of what we want to believe. It's almost existential." She's also mentioned feeling disconnected from people, like she's observing them from a distance. Nicholas's heart pounded in his chest. This didn't sound like Sophie at all. The thought of his little girl speaking about such complex and dark ideas made his skin crawl. "She mentioned this in class?" Nicholas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes," the teacher replied, her expression concerned. "She's very articulate when she talks about these things, but it feels out of place. I just thought you should know." Nicholas nodded, numb. He thanked the teacher and left the school in a daze, his mind spinning with thoughts of Sophie's transformation. As he drove home, the unsettling feeling inside him grew stronger. Something was wrong. This wasn't just a child healing from grief. This was something deeper, darker. That evening, as Nicholas sat alone in his study, staring at the same family portrait he had gazed at for months, a thought struck him. Amelia. He had allowed Amelia into their home, into Sophie's mind. And while she had certainly brought Sophie out of her silence, he couldn't ignore the strange changes in his daughter. The way she talked, the eerie knowledge she now possessed, the distant way she interacted with him. Could Amelia be the reason behind all this? Was she influencing Sophie in ways Nicholas hadn't anticipated? Nicholas's jaw clenched as the realization hit him hard. He had been so focused on Sophie that he hadn't fully questioned Amelia's methods. Her mysterious approach, her insistence on secrecy, the way she seemed to understand Sophie in ways he didn't. The next morning, Nicholas watched as Amelia and Sophie sat together in the living room, working on one of Sophie's drawings. Amelia was guiding her gently, her voice soothing, but Nicholas couldn't shake the suspicion growing inside him. He had let a stranger into his home. But who was Amelia, really? And what was she doing to his daughter? The unease that had been building in him over the past weeks had finally taken root, and now it gnawed at him, refusing to let go. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind racing with questions. Who was Amelia really? The thought echoed in his mind. She had transformed Sophie in ways that felt almost unnatural. And the more Nicholas tried to convince himself that Sophie's improvement was a positive thing, the more that insidious doubt grew. At 3 a.m., he gave up on sleep. Pulling himself out of bed, Nicholas made his way downstairs to his study. The darkened house felt eerily still, as if even the walls were holding their breath. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat at his desk, staring blankly at the computer screen in front of him. Something was wrong. He had been so desperate to help Sophie that he hadn't questioned Amelia's background when she arrived. Now, as he sat in the quiet of his study, he realized how little he knew about her. She had seemed professional, confident, even mysterious, but he had never truly looked into her past. Grabbing the laptop, Nicholas began to search. He typed her name into various databases, scanning through credentials, articles, anything that could tell him more about who Amelia really was. But everything seemed normal on the surface. She had completed her education, worked in child psychology for a few years, and her previous clients had given her glowing reviews. Yet something didn't feel right. Nicholas's fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the screen. He remembered the first time Amelia had stepped into their home, how Sophie had changed so drastically after that. And those drawings, the ones with Maria, the ones that showed him fading away. Sophie had never spoken of her mother in such a complicated, almost philosophical way before Amelia arrived. Was it a coincidence? Or was Amelia subtly guiding Sophie in ways he couldn't see? Suddenly, an idea struck him. A long shot, but it was all he had. What if there was a connection between Amelia and Maria? The thought was absurd, yet it lingered in his mind like a haunting melody. He searched through old emails, personal records, anything that could link Amelia to his wife. But there was nothing, no obvious link, at least. Frustrated, Nicholas leaned back in his chair, the dim light of the computer casting shadows across the room. He was about to close the laptop when his eyes landed on an old folder he hadn't opened in years, a digital archive of Maria's writings. She had been a writer, working on short stories and essays, some of which he had never finished before she died. Curious and desperate for any connection, Nicholas clicked on the folder. He began scrolling through Maria's old notes and journal entries, feeling a pang of sorrow as her familiar words filled the screen. He missed her so much. The way she used to breathe life into every sentence, her quiet wisdom, her ability to make even the mundane seem beautiful. But as he scrolled further, something caught his eye. One document, dated years ago, before Sophie was born, had an unfamiliar title, The Woman in the Mirror. It was a short story draft Maria had been working on, one that Nicholas had never read before. He clicked on it, and as the file opened, his heart began to race. The story was about a woman named Amelia. Nicholas's breath caught in his throat as he read the opening lines. The Amelia in Maria's story was described as mysterious, a woman with a tragic past who had once been close to the protagonist, a character who seemed suspiciously like Maria herself. As Nicholas read further, he felt a chill creep down his spine. In the story, Amelia was portrayed as both a guide and a threat, someone who could either lead the protagonist to healing or push her into darkness. Nicholas sat back, his mind reeling. The name couldn't be a coincidence. Amelia, a character Maria had written about years ago, long before this woman entered their lives. The details were too specific, too strange to ignore. He had always known that Maria wrote from personal experience, drawing inspiration from people she knew or events that shaped her. But why would she write about this Amelia? Was it someone from Maria's past? Desperate for answers, Nicholas scoured through more of Maria's files, looking for any other mention of the name. Finally, he found a brief journal entry, buried in a folder of personal notes. I keep thinking about Amelia, about the past. There are things I've never told Nicholas, things that haunt me. I wonder if he'll ever understand why I had to keep this secret, why I can't let her back into my life. Nicholas's heart raced as he read those words. Let her back into my life? He sat there, stunned. Maria had known someone named Amelia, someone important enough to write about, but also someone she had deliberately kept from him. And now, that same name had reappeared in their lives, as if a ghost from Maria's past had returned. It wasn't just a coincidence. This Amelia wasn't just a random psychologist who had been hired to help Sophie. She had a history with Maria, one Nicholas knew nothing about. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor, his mind spinning. He had to confront Amelia. He couldn't let this go on any longer without understanding the full truth. His body was tense with anger and confusion. How could he have let someone like this into his home, into Sophie's life, without knowing who she really was? The next morning, Nicholas waited for Amelia in the living room, his mind racing with questions. When she finally appeared, calm as ever, he wasted no time. I need to know the truth, Nicholas said, his voice hard. Who are you, really? And what connection did you have with Maria? Amelia's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, something sharp and guarded. She didn't speak right away, clearly measuring her response. What do you mean? She asked, her voice still controlled. You know exactly what I mean, Nicholas snapped, stepping closer. I found Maria's old writings, her stories, her journals. She wrote about you. She knew you, and she kept it from me. Why? What were you to her? Amelia's gaze didn't waver, but Nicholas could see her calculating, trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, she sighed softly, lowering her defenses just slightly. I knew Maria, yes, Amelia admitted, her voice low, but it was a long time ago, before you two met. Nicholas's hands clenched into fists. And you didn't think to tell me this before you started working with my daughter? Amelia remained calm, but her tone turned firm. It wasn't relevant. My relationship with Maria had nothing to do with Sophie. What matters now is Sophie's healing. Nicholas's mind raced with questions, but one burned brighter than the others. What was your relationship with her? Amelia hesitated, her eyes darkening. We were close, very close, but things changed. Maria and I went separate ways, and she didn't want to bring up the past. I respected her decision. Nicholas felt a wave of anger surge through him. And now you're here, in our lives, without ever telling me the truth. How can I trust you with Sophie when you've been lying to me this whole time? Amelia stood her ground, her voice calm but edged with steel. I haven't lied to you, Nicholas. My connection to Maria is in the past. My only focus now is Sophie and helping her heal. That's all. Nicholas stared at her, his mind torn between fury and confusion. He didn't know what to believe anymore. The woman standing in front of him had somehow woven herself into the fabric of his family, and yet she was a stranger, someone with secrets, someone who had known his wife in ways he never had. As he stood there, grappling with the truth, one thought echoed louder than all the others. What else was Amelia hiding? And how far had her influence already reached into Sophie's life? Nicholas hadn't slept since the confrontation with Amelia. His mind was a storm of unanswered questions, swirling with confusion, anger, and betrayal. The revelation that Amelia had known Maria and kept it a secret left him rattled, as if the very foundation of his life had been shaken. He couldn't help but wonder what else had been hidden from him and how deep Amelia's influence over Sophie really went. The house was quiet that night, the kind of silence that weighed on the soul. Nicholas found himself pacing the hallway outside Sophie's room, listening for any sound, any hint that might confirm or dispel his growing fears. Amelia had insisted that her connection to Maria had no bearing on Sophie's treatment, but Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying, or at least, hiding something important. Driven by desperation, Nicholas knew what he had to do. He had to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. If Amelia wouldn't tell him everything, he'd find the answers himself. Early the next morning, while Amelia and Sophie were out for their scheduled therapy session at the park, Nicholas took the opportunity to search Amelia's belongings. He felt a deep pang of guilt as he rifled through her things, knowing how much Sophie trusted Amelia. But his instinct screamed at him that something was off, and he could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that his daughter was in danger. In Amelia's room, everything seemed ordinary, almost too ordinary. The bed was neatly made, her suitcase placed in the corner, and the desk held only the bare essentials. But Nicholas wasn't looking for the obvious. He needed to dig deeper. It wasn't until he opened the bottom drawer of her desk that he found something. A locked journal, its leather cover worn and old. His heart raced as he stared at the book. Why would she keep something locked away like this? Without hesitation, he grabbed a letter opener from the desk and pried open the small lock. The snap of the lock breaking sent a chill down his spine, but he pressed on. Nicholas opened the journal and began to read. What he found sent shockwaves through his entire body. The entries were not what he had expected. Instead of professional notes about Sophie, the pages were filled with deeply personal reflections, some from years ago, and some written more recently. Amelia's thoughts were raw, unfiltered, and unsettling. She wrote about Maria, about their past, about secrets Nicholas had never known existed. October 2010, Maria found me again. After all these years, she walked back into my life like nothing had changed. But so much had. She's married now, has a daughter. It feels strange, like I've lost something, someone I once held so close. But she's different. She doesn't want to talk about our past, about the things we promised to keep between us. I see the fear in her eyes. She doesn't want me to remind her of what we used to be, what I used to be to her. Nicholas's heart pounded as he read the words. What I used to be to her. He flipped to the next entry, his breath coming faster. November 2010. Maria has changed. She's pulling away from me, as if the weight of her new life is suffocating her. I tried to talk to her about it, but she shut me down. She's scared. Scared of what I know, scared of what we shared in the past. But I can't let her forget. She can't erase me that easily. I'm part of her, whether she admits it or not. Nicholas's hands trembled as he gripped the journal. His mind spun with the implications. He had always known Maria had her secrets, but he had never imagined anything like this. What had happened between Maria and Amelia? And why had Maria hidden this part of her life from him? He continued reading, the entries growing more erratic as the years passed. January 2012, she's gone. I thought she would come back to me, that she would remember who she really is. But now she's dead, and all that's left of her is Sophie. I see Maria in her daughter's eyes, in the way she holds herself. I thought I could move on, but I can't. Sophie is all that's left of Maria's memory, and I owe it to her to keep that alive. Even if Nicholas doesn't understand, even if he can't know, he can never know. Nicholas slammed the journal shut, his pulse racing. Amelia wasn't just a therapist. She wasn't just someone who had been close to Maria in the past. She was obsessed, consumed by whatever twisted connection she believed they had. And now, she had latched onto Sophie as if she were a living extension of Maria. The realization hit him like a freight train. Amelia wasn't helping Sophie heal. She was trying to mold Sophie into some version of Maria, some twisted fantasy that only existed in her mind. Without thinking, Nicholas shoved the journal back into the drawer, locking it as best he could, before racing down the stairs. He grabbed his phone, his hands shaking, and called Julia, his assistant. I need you to find everything you can about Amelia. Everything, he said, his voice barely steady. I want to know who she really is, her past, her connections to Maria. Everything. Julia, sensing the urgency in his voice, didn't ask questions. I'll get on it right away, she promised before hanging up. Nicholas paced the living room, his mind in overdrive. The pieces were starting to fit together, but it was a horrifying picture that was forming. Amelia had known Maria long before he did. Their relationship was deep, too deep, and now she had insinuated herself into his daughter's life. The thought sent chills down his spine. How much of Sophie's transformation was truly her own healing, and how much was Amelia's manipulation? When Amelia and Sophie returned later that afternoon, Nicholas was waiting for them. Sophie seemed her usual, cheerful self, but Nicholas's eyes were focused on Amelia, searching for any sign of the darkness he now knew lurked beneath the surface. "How was the park?" Nicholas asked, forcing a smile as Sophie plopped down on the couch. "It was great, Dad," Sophie said, smiling. "We saw some ducks, and Amelia taught me how to draw them." Nicholas nodded, but his attention never left Amelia, who stood calmly by the doorway, her expression unreadable. He could feel the tension building between them, an unspoken war that neither of them would openly acknowledge. As the evening wore on, Nicholas kept his distance, watching them both carefully. Every time Sophie laughed or smiled, it felt like a twisted mockery of the innocence she once had. The more Nicholas observed, the more he realized just how deep Amelia's control ran. Sophie looked at her with admiration, almost reverence, as if she were the only person who truly understood her. That night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Nicholas cornered Amelia in the hallway. "I read your journal," he said bluntly, his voice low but deadly serious. Amelia's eyes flickered with something, surprise, maybe anger, but she quickly masked it. "You had no right. I had every right," Nicholas interrupted, his voice rising with fury. "You've been lying to me from the start. You knew Maria. You had some kind of relationship with her, and you kept it from me. And now you're doing God knows what to my daughter." Amelia took a deep breath, her expression hardening. "I'm trying to help Sophie," she said firmly. "She needs someone who understands what she's going through. Someone who knew her mother." Nicholas's voice dropped to a whisper, the anger boiling just beneath the surface. "You're trying to turn Sophie into Maria, aren't you? You think I don't see it, but I do. You're using my daughter to keep Maria's memory alive, to recreate whatever sick fantasy you had with her." Amelia's face remained calm, but her eyes were cold, calculating. "Sophie is her mother's daughter," she said quietly. "She needs to understand who she is, where she comes from. I'm helping her see that." Nicholas's heart pounded in his chest. He felt the walls closing in, the realization that he had let a dangerous woman into his home, into his family's life. "You're done here," he said, his voice trembling with rage. "I want you out of this house by tomorrow. And if you go near Sophie again, I swear." Amelia's smile was chilling, her calm demeanor more terrifying than any outburst. "You can't protect her from the truth, Nicholas. She's more like Maria than you realize. You can push me away, but Sophie will always seek out her mother's legacy. She'll come to me eventually." Nicholas stared at her, a deep fear taking hold as he realized that Amelia wasn't going to leave quietly. This was far from over. The air in the house felt thick, like the moment before a storm, tense and oppressive. Nicholas hadn't slept since his confrontation with Amelia the night before. She was still in the house, his house, despite his demand that she leave. Her presence felt like a shadow lurking around every corner, a constant reminder of the danger she posed to Sophie. He had barely spoken to Sophie that morning, too consumed by the mounting dread that something was about to happen. The more he thought about it, the clearer it became. Amelia was not going to leave quietly. She had a hold on Sophie that was too strong, too deep, and Nicholas feared that if he didn't act soon, he would lose his daughter completely. It was late afternoon when the moment he had been dreading arrived. Nicholas found Amelia in the living room, sitting calmly with a book in her lap, as if nothing had happened the night before. The sight of her there, in the heart of his home, made his blood boil. "This has gone on long enough," Nicholas said, his voice low but trembling with fury. "You need to leave now." Amelia looked up from her book, her expression composed, as though he hadn't just threatened to throw her out. "I understand you're upset, Nicholas," she said evenly, "but you need to think about what's best for Sophie." Nicholas clenched his fists, barely able to contain his anger. "What's best for Sophie? You think manipulating her, filling her head with your twisted fantasies about Maria, is what's best for her?" Amelia's gaze hardened, and she closed the book with a soft thud. "You're blinded by your grief, Nicholas. You've never been able to give Sophie what she truly needs because you've always been too focused on yourself. That's why Maria kept so much from you, because she knew you could never handle the truth. Nicholas's chest tightened, the sting of her words hitting deeper than he wanted to admit. Don't you dare talk about Maria like you know her better than I did, he spat. She was my wife. Sophie is my daughter. And you, he pointed at her, his voice rising. You're just an intruder in our lives. You have no right. Amelia stood up, her calm demeanor cracking for the first time. I have every right, she snapped, her voice sharp and cold. I was there for Maria when you weren't. I knew her better than you ever did. And Sophie? She's more like her mother than you realize. You think keeping her locked up in this house, surrounded by your grief, is helping her? She needs to understand who her mother really was, and you, she gestured at him with contempt, are too selfish to let her. Nicholas's heart pounded in his chest. I am her father, he growled, stepping closer to Amelia. I know what's best for her. You don't know anything, Amelia shot back, her voice shaking with a strange mix of anger and something darker, almost like pity. You never knew Maria. Not really. You were just a part of the life she built to escape the past, to forget about what we had. But she never forgot. And now, Sophie is living in that shadow, caught between who she is and who you want her to be. Nicholas recoiled, her words cutting through him like a blade. He had always known that Maria had secrets, but he had chosen to ignore them, to trust that whatever she had been hiding belonged in the past. Now, it felt as if all those buried truths were rising to the surface, threatening to pull Sophie down with them. I'm not letting you turn Sophie into some version of Maria you've created in your head, Nicholas said, his voice dangerously low. You're done here. You're leaving today. Amelia's eyes flashed with a strange intensity. You don't understand, Nicholas. Sophie is already on that path. You can't stop it. The more you try to keep her from the truth, the more she'll pull away from you. At that moment, Sophie's voice rang out from the hallway, making both Nicholas and Amelia freeze. What's going on? Nicholas turned to see Sophie standing at the doorway, her face pale, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. She had clearly overheard part of the conversation, and the tension in the room was palpable. Sophie, Nicholas began, stepping toward her, his voice softening. It's okay. Amelia and I were just having a conversation, but Sophie didn't move. Her gaze flickered between her father and Amelia, her eyes clouded with uncertainty. What are you talking about? She asked, her voice trembling. What truth? Nicholas felt his heart sink. He hadn't wanted Sophie to get caught in the middle of this, but now there was no way to shield her from what was happening. Sophie, listen to me, Nicholas said, trying to keep his voice calm. Amelia has been telling you things about your mother that aren't true. She's trying to make you believe things that are true. Amelia interrupted, stepping forward. Her voice was firm, resolute. Sophie, your father is keeping things from you. About your mother. About who she really was. Nicholas's blood ran cold as he saw Sophie's face contort with confusion and fear. No, Sophie, he said quickly, his heart pounding. That's not true. Amelia is trying to manipulate you. Stop, Sophie shouted, her voice cracking with emotion. Just stop. The room fell into a suffocating silence as Sophie stood there, her chest heaving, her eyes filling with tears. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. What's going on? Why are you both lying to me? Nicholas took a step toward her, his hands trembling. Sophie, we're not lying to you. Your mother loved you. She was a good person, and she was a good person, Amelia interrupted again, her voice sharp. But there's more to her story than your father wants you to know. Nicholas turned on Amelia, his patience snapping. Enough. You don't get to decide what Sophie knows about her mother. But Sophie wasn't listening anymore. She was staring at the ground, her face pale, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Tell me the truth, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Who was my mom? What are you hiding from me? The weight of her words crashed over Nicholas like a wave. He had tried so hard to protect Sophie from the pain of Maria's secrets, to shield her from the things that could tear their family apart. But now, faced with his daughter's desperate plea for the truth, he felt the walls he had built around them crumble. "Sophie," Nicholas's voice broke as he struggled to find the right words. "Your mother had a complicated past. She didn't want you to know because she wanted you to have a normal life, free from the things that—" He trailed off, unsure how to explain the tangled web of Maria's past, the secrets she had buried. Amelia's voice cut through the silence. "Your mother loved you, Sophie," she said softly, stepping closer. "But she was trapped by her own choices. She wanted to protect you from those choices, just like your father is trying to do now. But you deserve to know who she really was." Nicholas felt his heart race as Sophie looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with confusion and hurt. He wanted to pull her into his arms, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth loomed large between them, a chasm that he wasn't sure he could cross. Sophie took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I want to know. I want to know everything." Nicholas's stomach dropped. He looked into his daughter's eyes and saw the same fire he had seen in Maria, that burning need for answers. He had spent so long trying to keep those answers from her, but now it seemed inevitable. Sophie wanted the truth, and there was no way to stop it. Amelia's gaze flickered toward Nicholas, a knowing look in her eyes. She had won this battle. Sophie had chosen the path that would lead her deeper into Maria's world. Nicholas swallowed hard, his throat tight. "Okay," he whispered, the weight of his decision crushing him. "You deserve to know." Sophie had retreated to her room after the emotional confrontation, leaving Nicholas and Amelia standing in the living room, the air between them heavy with unresolved tension. Nicholas felt a deep exhaustion settle over him, the weight of the secrets he had tried so hard to keep finally crashing down on him. There was no turning back now. Sophie knew there was more to her mother's story, and it was time to face that truth, no matter how painful. Amelia, still standing near the doorway, watched him with an unsettling calm. Her presence felt suffocating, her influence over Sophie undeniable. Nicholas had spent weeks trying to protect his daughter from this woman, only to realize that Sophie was already deeply entangled in Amelia's web. But now, with the confrontation behind them, Nicholas knew what he had to do. Without a word, Nicholas turned away from Amelia and walked up the stairs towards Sophie's room. He knocked gently on her door, his heart pounding in his chest. There was a long silence before Sophie's voice came, quiet and fragile. "Come in." Nicholas pushed the door open and stepped inside. Sophie was sitting on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She looked so small, so vulnerable, and Nicholas's heart ached at the sight. He sat down on the edge of the bed, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick with unspoken words, with the weight of all the things Nicholas had tried to protect her from. "I'm sorry," he whispered finally, his voice raw with emotion. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought if I kept those secrets hidden, you'd be safe." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain and confusion. "Why didn't you tell me? About Mom? About who she really was?" Nicholas took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "Your mother. She was complicated, Sophie. She loved you more than anything in this world. But there were things in her past, things she didn't want you to know. She thought that by keeping those things hidden, she could give you a normal life. A better life." Sophie's voice trembled. "But I deserve to know. I've been trying to understand her, and I feel like I don't even know who she was." Nicholas felt his chest tighten. He had feared this moment, the day when Sophie would ask questions he couldn't fully answer. But now, looking into her eyes, he realized that what Sophie needed wasn't more secrets. She needed the truth. And no matter how painful it was, he owed her that. "Your mother and Amelia, they were close. Before I ever met Maria," Nicholas began slowly, watching Sophie's reaction. "They had a relationship, a deep one. But things fell apart between them before you were born. When Maria met me, she wanted to leave that part of her life behind. She wanted a fresh start. That's why she never told me much about her past." Sophie's brow furrowed as she absorbed his words. "But why didn't you tell me this sooner? Why did you let Amelia stay?" Nicholas sighed. running a hand through his hair. "I didn't know about Amelia's connection to your mother until recently. When I found out, I was afraid of what it would do to you. I didn't want you to feel like your entire life had been built on lies. But I see now that hiding the truth only pushed you further away." Sophie wiped at her eyes, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just wanted to understand her." "I know," Nicholas said softly, his heart breaking for his daughter. "And you have every right to know. I should have trusted you to handle the truth." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, to Nicholas's surprise, Sophie shifted closer to him, resting her head on his shoulder. It was the first time in months that she had sought comfort from him, and it felt like a fragile, precious step toward rebuilding their broken bond. "Amelia, she made me feel like I was closer to Mom," Sophie said quietly, her voice laced with confusion. "But now I don't know what to believe." Nicholas wrapped an arm around her, holding her gently. "Amelia had her own reasons for wanting to stay connected to your mother's memory. But what matters now is how you feel, Sophie. Your relationship with your mom is yours. It's not defined by anyone else's memories or expectations." Sophie nodded slowly, her tears finally slowing. "I miss her so much, Dad." "I know," Nicholas whispered, his own eyes filling with tears. "I miss her too." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared grief settling between them like an old, familiar blanket. But this time, the silence wasn't as suffocating. It was filled with a sense of understanding, of two broken hearts slowly finding their way back to each other. Finally, Nicholas spoke again, his voice steady. "Amelia's leaving. She doesn't belong here anymore." Sophie didn't say anything for a long moment, but when she finally spoke, her voice was soft but resolute. "I think that's for the best." Nicholas nodded, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he could see a path forward. It wouldn't be easy, but he and Sophie could start to rebuild together. Later that evening, Nicholas confronted Amelia for the last time. She was standing in the hallway, her expression unreadable, as if she already knew what was coming. "I want you out by tomorrow," Nicholas said firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Amelia didn't argue. She looked at him with that same unnerving calm, as if this had been inevitable all along. "I hope you understand, Nicholas. I only wanted to help." "You've done enough," he replied coldly. "And from now on, you stay away from my daughter." Amelia's gaze flickered with something, regret, perhaps, or something darker, but she didn't respond. She simply nodded and turned away, walking down the hall without looking back. By the next morning, Amelia was gone. In the days that followed, the house began to feel lighter, the oppressive weight of the past slowly lifting. Nicholas and Sophie started to talk more, little by little, sharing memories of Maria, both good and bad. There were no more secrets between them, no more walls keeping them apart. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Sophie looked up at her father with a soft smile. "I think Mom would have been proud of us, of how we're handling things." Nicholas smiled back, feeling a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time. "I think so too." And in that moment, Nicholas realized that the void Maria had left behind could never be fully filled. But together, he and Sophie could build something new, something that honored Maria's memory while allowing them to move forward. For the first time in months, Nicholas felt a sense of peace. The shadows of the past had finally loosened their grip, and now, he and Sophie could begin the long, slow process of healing. 6 months had passed since Amelia had left, and with her departure, the house had changed. It was no longer a place haunted by secrets and grief. Instead, it had become a home again, a space where laughter slowly returned, where conversations no longer felt like walking on broken glass. Nicholas sat on the porch, watching as the late afternoon sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and pinks. In the distance, he could hear the faint sound of Sophie's laughter as she played with their neighbor's dog in the yard. The sound warmed his heart, a reminder of how far they had come. Sophie had changed in the months since everything had come to light. She wasn't the same little girl who had been lost in grief, nor was she the distant, almost eerie version of herself that Amelia had brought out. She was her now, still processing, still healing, but stronger. And for the first time, Nicholas felt like he was truly part of her journey. Their relationship had grown in ways Nicholas hadn't expected. They spent time together, more than they ever had before. Whether it was cooking dinner or just talking about Maria and the memories they cherished, it felt real again. The walls between them had fallen, and Sophie no longer carried the burden of silent grief alone. Nicholas had also found a new sense of closure regarding Maria. He had spent countless nights after Amelia's departure reading through Maria's old journals, learning more about the woman he had loved and the parts of her life that she had kept hidden. It hadn't been easy, but he came to understand why Maria had made the choices she did. The love she had for him, and more importantly for Sophie, had been real, despite the secrets she carried. In time, Nicholas came to realize that Maria had wanted to protect them both, but in doing so, she had underestimated their strength. They could have handled the truth, if only she had let them. But now, that truth was part of their story, part of what made their family strong. As the cool evening breeze drifted across the porch, Sophie came bounding up the steps, her face flushed with excitement. "Dad, you should have seen Buddy," she laughed, her smile lighting up her whole face. "He did the funniest thing with the ball." Nicholas smiled warmly at her, his heart swelling with pride and love. "Sounds like you two had fun," he said, standing up to ruffle her hair. Sophie rolled her eyes playfully, but there was an unmistakable warmth between them now, something that had taken time and trust to rebuild. As they stood there together, the last rays of sunlight fading, Nicholas knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be hard days, moments when the memories of Maria would creep back and bring tears. But they were moving forward, stronger than before. Sophie glanced up at him, a thoughtful expression on her face. "Do you think Mom would be happy with how we're doing?" she asked, her voice soft, almost hesitant. Nicholas smiled, pulling her close into a gentle hug. "I think she'd be proud of you," he said, his voice full of certainty. "And of us. We're doing okay, Sophie. Better than okay." Sophie leaned into him, the unspoken bond between father and daughter stronger than it had ever been. They had walked through the darkest parts of their grief together, and now, standing side by side, they were ready to embrace whatever the future held. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, Nicholas knew that they had finally found something close to peace. The past would always be with them, but it no longer controlled their lives. Together, they were writing a new chapter, one filled with hope, healing, and the quiet, steady joy of simply being there for each other. And for Nicholas, that was enough. More than enough.